August 28, 1944. Major Richard Connor, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot from the 78th Fighter Group, was leading his squadron back from a bomber escort mission when he saw something that shouldn't exist. A flash of silver, faster than anything he'd ever seen, streaked past his formation at an impossible speed. No propeller. No sound except a roar like tearing metal. Just pure terrifying velocity. What the hell was that? Crackled over his radio. For months, American bomber crews had been reporting something new in the skies over Germany. Something that made no sense. Aircraft without propellers that could outrun anything the Allies had. Intelligence dismissed most reports as misidentifications, combat stress, maybe even propaganda. But on that clear summer day in 1944, American pilots got their first confirmed look at the future of aerial warfare. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and it was about to shatter every assumption the Allies had about air superiority. Here's what made this aircraft extraordinary. The Me-262 could fly at 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. It climbed like a rocket. It carried 4 30mm cannons that could tear a B-17 bomber apart with a single burst. And in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was virtually untouchable. But the Me-262 had a fatal flaw. A weakness so fundamental that it transformed this revolutionary weapon from a potential war winner into an expensive curiosity that arrived far too late to matter. This is the story of the fastest fighter in World War II, and why it couldn't stay in the air long enough to change history. To understand the Me-262's promise and ultimate failure, we need to go back to 1939, before anyone had even heard of jet propulsion. When World War II began, the Luftwaffe possessed what many considered the finest fighter aircraft in the world, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Fast, maneuverable, and deadly, it dominated the skies over Poland and France. German aviation doctrine emphasized speed and climbing ability over everything else. Hit hard, hit fast, and get out. But by 1941, cracks were appearing in Germany's aerial dominance. British Spitfires were holding their own. And across the Atlantic, American aircraft designers were following a completely different philosophy. While Germany focused on lightweight, high-performance fighters optimized for short-range combat over Europe, American designers were solving a different problem. How do you protect bombers flying 2,000-mile missions deep into enemy territory? The answer came in 1943 with the P-51 Mustang. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something German fighters could only dream of. For Luftwaffe pilots, this meant nowhere was safe. The hunters had become the hunted. Meanwhile, in a research facility at Rostock-Marienhähe, a team of engineers led by Dr. Anselm Franz was working on something that would make propeller-driven fighters obsolete: a jet engine. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of using a propeller to pull an aircraft through the air, why not shoot a continuous stream of hot gases out the back? The Junkers Jumo 04 turbojet promised unprecedented speed and climbing performance. No propeller limitations, no complex reduction gearboxes, just pure thrust. In July 1942, test pilot Fritz Wendel climbed into an experimental aircraft designated the Me-262V3 for its first jet-powered flight. When both Jumo 004 engines roared to life and the sleek silver aircraft accelerated down the runway at Leipheim, aviation entered a new era. The performance was breathtaking. The Me-262 reached speeds that left every Allied fighter behind. It climbed to altitude faster than anything in existence. German test pilots who flew it came back with reports that bordered on science fiction. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters for the Luftwaffe and one of Germany's top aces with 104 victories, flew the Me-262 in May 1943. His assessment was immediate and emphatic. This aircraft opens up completely new possibilities for aerial combat. It's like a miracle. But Galland also noted something troubling in his report. The Me-262 consumed fuel at an astonishing rate. During high-speed combat or low-altitude flying, it burned through its 2,000-liter fuel capacity in about 40 minutes. Even under optimal conditions at high altitude, endurance maxed out at 90 minutes. For context, a P-51 Mustang could fly for nearly 5 hours with drop tanks. A Bf 109 could stay airborne for 2 hours, but the Me-262, less than an hour and a half in the best case, and realistically, just 30 to 45 minutes of useful combat time. German engineers knew about this limitation. They'd known since the aircraft's first flights, but in the calculus of 1943, they believed speed and firepower would compensate for limited endurance. After all, if you're twice as fast as the enemy, you only need half the time, right? The question is, why did Germany never fix this fatal flaw? Why did they push forward with an aircraft that could dominate any dogfight, but couldn't stay in the fight long enough to matter? The answer lies in a series of decisions that would doom the Me-262 before it ever reached operational status. By January 1944, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. American and British bombers were hammering industrial targets across the Reich. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. Fuel supplies were dwindling under Allied bombing campaigns. And then Adolf Hitler made a decision that would become one of the most controversial calls of the war. On a cold November day in 1943, Hitler watched a demonstration of the Me-262 at Insterburg. He was impressed by the aircraft's speed and asked Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring a simple question: "Can this aircraft carry bombs?" "Yes, mein Führer," Göring replied, perhaps too quickly. "About 500 kilograms," Hitler's eyes lit up. "Finally, the fast bomber I've been asking for? This will be our answer to the invasion forces." Hitler had become obsessed with the idea of revenge weapons, aircraft and missiles that could strike back at Allied forces. The Me-262 speed meant it could penetrate Allied air defenses, deliver its bomb load, and escape before enemy fighters could react. He immediately ordered that the Me-262 be developed primarily as a bomber, not a fighter. This order sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe's command structure. Adolf Galland and other fighter commanders protested vehemently. They argued that Germany desperately needed interceptors to defend against the bomber streams that were destroying German cities and factories. Using the Me-262 as a bomber was, in Galland's words, like using a racehorse to pull a milk cart. But Hitler was adamant. For months, Me-262 development was diverted to create the Sturmvogel, Stormbird bomber variant. Engineers had to reinforce the airframe for bomb racks, which added weight and reduced performance. Worse, it diverted production capacity and delayed the fighter version from reaching operational units. Did Hitler's bomber obsession delay the Me-262? Historical debate continues. Some historians argue the delay was minimal, that engine problems and material shortages would have prevented large-scale deployment anyway. Others contend that those crucial months cost Germany any chance of effective jet fighter deployment when it mattered most. What's indisputable is that by mid-1944, when Allied fighters were destroying the Luftwaffe over France and Germany, the Me-262 fighter variant was still stuck in bureaucratic limbo. Meanwhile, the aircraft's fundamental problem, fuel endurance, remained unaddressed. Here's where the story gets fascinating. German engineers weren't ignorant. They knew the Jumo 004 engines were fuel-hungry beasts. At full throttle, each engine consumed approximately 635 liters of fuel per hour. With 2 engines and a 2,000-liter fuel capacity, the math was brutally simple. But there was another, more insidious problem lurking. Beneath the surface, the engines themselves were ticking time bombs. Germany's increasingly desperate resource situation meant that the Jumo 004 couldn't be built with the heat-resistant nickel alloys required for reliable operation. Instead, engineers substituted cheaper, less durable materials. The result? The Jumo 004 had an operational lifespan of just 10 to 12 hours in early production models. Let me repeat that, 10 hours. That's about 3 or 4 combat sorties before the engine needed a complete rebuild or replacement. By September 1944, after numerous improvements, the engine's life extended to 25 hours. For comparison, a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in a P-51 Mustang had a time between overhauls of about 250 hours, 10 times longer. Pilot accounts from this period paint a vivid picture of the Me-262's operational reality. Lieutenant Fritz Müller, a pilot with Kommando Nowotny, the first operational Me-262 unit, recalled, "We would take off knowing we had perhaps 40 minutes of fuel. The engines were temperamental. Rapid throttle movements could cause flameouts, and we never knew if we'd make it back before something failed. The engines were particularly vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The 2 phases of flight when the Me-262 was slowest and most vulnerable. Allied fighter pilots quickly learned to patrol near known Me-262 bases, waiting to bounce the jets when they were most defenseless. But when everything worked, when fuel and engines cooperated, the Me-262 was devastating. Did you know that a single Me-262 pilot, Oberleutnant Kurt Welter, claimed 63 aerial victories flying the jet at night? Most of them were British Mosquito bombers that thought they were safe under cover of darkness. The Me-262's speed advantage meant that even at night, nothing could escape it. On October 7, 1944, a formation of 40 Me-262s from Commando Nowotny attacked a massive American bomber stream near Akmar. The jets tore through the formation like sharks through a school of fish. Their 30mm cannons required just a few hits to bring down a B-17. American gunners, trained to lead targets flying at 300 miles per hour, couldn't adjust their aim fast enough for aircraft doing 540. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes. 7 bombers went down. The Me-262s disappeared before P-51 escorts could react. But here's the brutal reality. Of the 40 Me-262s that took off, only 32 made it back. 3 ran out of fuel and crashed attempting emergency landings. 2 suffered engine failures. 3 were shot down by P-51s that caught them during their vulnerable landing approach. A 20% operational loss rate. Not from combat, but from the aircraft's fundamental limitations. Major Georg Peter Eder, a Luftwaffe ace who transitioned to the Me-262, later wrote, "The 262 wasn't really a fighter aircraft in the traditional sense. It was a high-speed hit-and-run platform. You made one pass at maximum speed, fired your cannons, and then you ran like hell before. Your fuel gauge hit 0. This brings us to November 8, 1944, a date that would expose both the Me-262's promise and its fatal limitations in the most public way possible. Major Walter Nowotny, a 258 victory ace and national hero, was leading his commando unit from an airfield at Akmar. American intelligence knew the base's location. As Nowotny and his wingman took off to intercept a B-17 formation, a flight of P-51 Mustangs from the 361st Fighter Group was waiting just off the field. What happened next has been reconstructed from radio intercepts, Allied combat reports, and German records. Nowotny engaged the bombers first, downing 2 B-17s in quick succession, but his attacks consumed fuel rapidly and caught the attention of a P-51 flight led by Lieutenant Robert Goebel. The Mustangs dove to intercept. Nowotny's wingman, seeing the American fighters, broke off and headed back to base. Nowotny continued his attack on the bombers, perhaps not realizing how low his fuel had dropped. The radio transcript from Nowotny's final moments is chilling. "I'm hit. Engine failure." Then seconds later, "I'm burning. My God, I'm burning." Nowotny's Me-262 crashed near Bramsche. Whether he was shot down by P-51s or suffered a catastrophic engine failure as his fuel ran out remains debated. What's certain is that one of Germany's top aces died flying an aircraft that couldn't stay in the air long enough to get him safely home. The incident shocked the Luftwaffe. If Walter Nowotny, an experienced pilot with hundreds of combat missions, couldn't survive in a Me-262, what hope did less experienced pilots have? Adolf Galland tried one more time to salvage the situation. In January 1945, he convinced leadership to form Jagdverband 44, an elite Me-262 unit staffed entirely by experienced aces. The logic was sound. Give the temperamental jet to pilots who knew how to manage its limitations. JV-44 operated from Munich Riem and achieved remarkable success, flying just 25 to 30 sorties in March and April 1945. They claimed over 50 Allied aircraft destroyed. The kill-to-loss ratio was impressive, roughly 4-1 in favor of the Me-262, but it didn't matter. By April 1945, Germany had lost the war. Fuel was almost non-existent. Allied armies were closing in on Munich, and the Me-262, for all its revolutionary technology, couldn't change the outcome. Here's a telling statistic. Germany produced approximately $1,430 Me-262s before the war ended, but only about 200 ever saw combat. The rest sat on airfields, unable to fly because of fuel shortages, missing engines, or lack of trained pilots. Of the 200 that flew combat missions, roughly 100 were lost. They claimed 542 Allied aircraft destroyed, a number that some historians believe is inflated, as German overclaiming was rampant in the war's final months. More conservative estimates suggest around 300 to 400 actual kills. Even taking the higher number, the math is sobering. 542 kills spread across thousands of sorties, with a 50% attrition rate and astronomical maintenance requirements. The Me-262 was phenomenal when it worked, but it rarely worked long enough. Let me take you inside the cockpit of an Me-262 on a typical combat mission in March 1945. This will help you understand why fuel endurance destroyed this revolutionary aircraft's potential. 7:30 hours. Oberleutnant Hermann Buchner straps into Me-262 A1A White 7 at Munich Riem. He's flown 17 missions in the jet and knows its quirks intimately. The pre-flight check takes longer than in a Bf-109. The JUMO engines are temperamental, and any sign of trouble means scrubbing the mission. Both engines start cleanly. Good sign. Fuel tanks are full, 2,000 liters. In his mind, Buchner is already doing the math. Taxi and takeoff, minus 50 liters. Climb to altitude, minus 200 liters. That leaves 1,750 liters for combat and return. At cruise, maybe an hour and 10 minutes total time. At combat speed, 45 minutes maximum, so 745 hours. Buchner advances the throttles carefully. Too quickly and the engines can flame out. The Me-262 accelerates down the runway, slower than you'd expect for such a powerful aircraft. It's heavy. The takeoff roll is long. He's vulnerable to any Allied fighter that might be lurking. Wheels up, climbing at 3,900 feet per minute, faster than anything the Allies have. By Euro 755, he's at 25,000 feet, leveling off. Fuel remaining, approximately 1,950 liters. Time aloft, about 10 minutes. His mission, intercept Allied bombers reported heading toward Munich. 802 hours. Ground control vectors him toward a formation of B-17s with P-51 escort. He can see them at a distance, dozens of bombers in tight formation, silver Mustangs weaving above them. This is where the Me-262's speed advantage kicks in. Buchner pushes the throttles forward and accelerates to 460 miles per hour. The P-51s, cruising at 340, can't match his speed. He has perhaps 2 minutes, maybe 3, before his closing. Speed carries him past the formation, and his fuel situation becomes critical. 0804 hours, 400 meters. The bombers grow in his sight. He selects a B-17 on the formation's edge, aims his 430mm cannons, and fires a 2-second burst. 55 rounds downrange. The B-17's wing erupts in flames. No time to watch. He's already past the formation, diving away at maximum speed. A P-51 tries to follow but can't match his velocity. Within seconds, Buchner is clear. But look at the fuel gauge. He's burned through nearly 400 liters in that single attack run. Between the high-speed approach, the acceleration, and the combat maneuvers, the JUMO engines consumed fuel at a staggering rate, 806 hours. Time to head home. Buchner throttles back to cruise speed and points his aircraft toward Munich Riem, about 80 kilometers away. Fuel remaining, approximately 1,350 liters. Plenty for the return flight, if nothing goes wrong. 2 hours. Something goes wrong. A warning light flickers. Engine temperature on the port JUMO is rising. Not critically, but enough to be concerning. Buchner reduces throttle on that engine, increasing it slightly on the starboard side to maintain altitude and speed. Now his fuel calculation changes. The starboard engine, working harder, is burning more fuel. His endurance has dropped. What was a comfortable margin is now tight. 820 hours. Munich Riem airfield is in sight. Fuel remaining, approximately 800 liters. Still enough, but if he has to wave off the landing and go around, he'll be cutting it extremely close. He lowers the landing gear, reduces speed. The Me-262 handles poorly at low speeds, another vulnerability. If Allied fighters are patrolling the area, this is when they'll strike. 823 hours. Touchdown. Buchner taxis to the dispersal area and shuts down the engines. Fuel remaining, about 650 liters, roughly a third of his starting fuel. Total mission time, 38 minutes. Actual combat time, approximately 2 minutes. 1 B-17 confirmed destroyed. The ground crew immediately swarms the aircraft. The port engine needs inspection, possibly a full replacement. Best case, the aircraft will be ready for another mission tomorrow. Worst case, it's grounded for a week. This was the reality of Me-262 operations. Short missions, high risk, constant maintenance, and fuel consumption so severe that pilots spent more time worrying about making it home than fighting the enemy. Now contrast this with a P-51 Mustang mission on the same day. Captain James Howard takes off from Bodney, England at 0900 hours. His mission, escort bombers to Munich and back. Total distance, approximately 1,400 miles. With drop tanks, his P-51 carries enough fuel for nearly 5 hours of flight time. He reaches Munich around 11:45, engages German fighters for 20 minutes, expends ammunition, and still has enough fuel to escort the bombers all the way back to France before peeling off to return to base. Total mission time, 4 hours, 40 minutes. He lands with comfortable fuel reserves, one aircraft with 40 minutes of endurance, another with nearly 5 hours. Both are cutting-edge fighters, but only one can actually execute the strategic missions that matter. This is why the Me-262, for all its spectacular performance, couldn't change the war. It was a sprinter in a marathon, a drag racer on an endurance circuit. Tactically brilliant, strategically irrelevant. German engineers knew this. Pilots knew this. But by the time the aircraft entered service, Germany had no other options. The Allied bomber offensive had to be stopped somehow, and the Me-262 was the only weapon that could catch the bombers. So they flew it anyway, knowing every mission was a calculated risk. Knowing that fuel gauges were as dangerous as enemy fighters. Knowing that the revolutionary jet fighter was fundamentally hobbled by the very technology that made it so fast. April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his Berlin bunker. Within days, Germany surrenders. And scattered across dozens of airfields, abandoned Me-262s sit silently. Out of fuel, out of time, out of war. What happened to the key players in this story? Adolf Galland, the Me-262's most vocal advocate, survived the war. He flew combat missions with JV-44 until the very end, claiming several victories in the jet. After the war, he moved to Argentina, where he advised the Argentine Air Force before returning to Germany. He spent the rest of his life as an aviation consultant and author. He died in 1996 at age 83, still maintaining that the Me-262 could have been a war winner if deployed earlier and in greater numbers. Kurt Welter, the top-scoring Me-262 pilot with 63 claimed victories, many disputed, disappeared after the war. Some sources suggest he died in a car accident in 1949. Others believe he emigrated and changed his identity. Hermann Buchner, the pilot whose typical mission we just followed, survived the war with 12 confirmed jet victories. He became a commercial pilot and later worked for Lufthansa. He gave numerous interviews about his Me-262 experience, always emphasizing the aircraft's brilliance and its fatal limitations. The Me-262 itself left a profound legacy. When Allied forces overran German airfields in 1945, they captured dozens of intact jets. American, British, and Soviet engineers swarmed over them, examining every detail. The Americans shipped several Me-262s back to Wright Field in Ohio for evaluation. Test pilot Colonel Harold Watson flew one extensively and reported, "The aircraft's performance is remarkable, but its operational limitations would prevent it from being an effective weapon in sustained combat. The fuel endurance issue alone would make it unsuitable for most missions." The Soviets were perhaps most impressed. They captured a production facility and hundreds of engineers. Within years, they developed their own jet fighters heavily influenced by German designs. The MiG-15, which would terrorize American pilots in Korea just 5 years later, owed a significant debt to the Me-262's pioneering technology. Britain's own Gloucester Meteor, the only Allied jet to see combat in World War II, had similar performance to the Me-262, but arrived too late to influence the war's outcome. Interestingly, British designers faced the exact same fuel endurance challenges. Early jets were simply thirsty. The fuel problem that plagued the Me-262 wouldn't be fully solved until the 1950s. with the development of more efficient jet engines and aircraft designed specifically for extended operations. The F-86 Sabre, F-100 Super Sabre, and other first-generation jet fighters of the Cold War era finally achieved the balance of speed, range, and reliability that the Me-262 promised but couldn't deliver. Of the 430 Me-262s built, only a handful survive today. Several are in museums. The Smithsonian has one, the RAF Museum has one, and Germany's Deutsches Museum displays several examples. A few flying replicas were built in the 1990s and 2000s, powered by modern engines that actually work reliably. The human cost of the Me-262 program is harder to quantify. Hundreds of pilots were killed flying or training in the aircraft, as many from fuel exhaustion, engine failures, and landing accidents as from enemy fire. Thousands of engineers and factory workers died in Allied bombing raids on production facilities, and an unknowable number of Allied bomber crews were killed by Me-262 attacks. For all that sacrifice, the Me-262's strategic impact was minimal. It shot down some Allied aircraft, disrupted some bombing missions, and provided valuable intelligence to post-war jet programs. But it didn't stop the Allied bombing campaign. It didn't prevent the invasion of Germany. It didn't change the war's outcome by even a single day. One final fascinating detail. Captured German documents revealed that engineers had proposed a solution to the fuel problem. They designed a reconnaissance variant, the Me-262B1A, with additional fuel tanks in the fuselage. These test aircraft achieved endurance of up to 2 hours, still short by conventional standards, but a 33% improvement. But by the time these modifications were ready for production, it was March 1945. Germany had weeks left. There was no fuel for existing aircraft, much less experimental variants. The improved Me-262 never made it beyond a handful of prototypes, so close, and yet so impossibly far. The story of the Messerschmitt Me-262 teaches us something profound about technological innovation and strategic reality. The Me-262 was, without question, a marvel. It pioneered technologies that would dominate military aviation for the next 70 years. It proved that jet propulsion was viable for combat aircraft. It terrified Allied pilots and impressed engineers worldwide. But brilliant technology means nothing if it can't fulfill the mission. The Me-262 was designed to be a fighter, to intercept, engage, and destroy enemy aircraft. Yet its crippling fuel endurance meant it spent more time on the ground than in combat. It was a racehorse that could only run a quarter mile before collapsing. Germany needed endurance more than speed. They needed fighters that could patrol for hours, protecting industrial targets across their shrinking territory. They needed aircraft that pilots could fly without constantly watching fuel gauges and praying engines wouldn't fail. Instead, they got a jet that could outrun anything in the sky for 40 minutes, then had to land or crash. The irony is brutal. Germany pioneered jet aviation and still lost the air war. Because innovation without sustainability is just expensive failure. There's a broader lesson here about warfare, technology, and strategic planning. Germany produced numerous wonder weapons in World War II's final years. The Me-262, the V-2 rocket, the Type 21 submarine. All were technologically advanced. All arrived too late, and all suffered from the same fundamental problem. They consumed resources Germany no longer had. The Me-262 needed specialized fuel, rare materials, experienced pilots, protected airfields, and time, none of which Germany possessed in 1944-45. It was the right aircraft for 1943, arriving in 1945. Meanwhile, the Allies flew obsolete propeller-driven fighters that could stay airborne for hours, could be maintained by relatively inexperienced crews, could operate from rough airfields, and could be produced by the thousands. Boring perhaps, but devastatingly effective. Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, was asked after the war whether the Me-262 concerned him. His response was characteristically blunt. A revolutionary aircraft that can only fly for half an hour isn't revolutionary. It's a curiosity, and that's ultimately what the Me-262 was, a fascinating, impressive, technologically brilliant curiosity that arrived just in time to change nothing. In 1945, as American soldiers walked through abandoned German airfields and photographed Me-262s sitting silently in revetments, One GI reportedly wrote on a captured jet's fuselage, "Great plane. Shame about the fuel." That soldier understood what German engineers, pilots, and commanders learned too late. In war, perfect is the enemy of good enough, and good enough with endurance beats perfect without it every single time. The Me-262 could outrun everyone. It just couldn't outrun its own fatal flaw.